Alrighty, let's get started. My name is Ron Hamilton with PTP, Performance Technology Partners. And today we're going to talk about web application security vulnerabilities. We've done a number, many web application layer security assessments here for various state California agencies. I'm usually hesitant to name clients, so I'll just put in the disclaimer that I'll name some clients, and none of the clients that I name are involved in any of the top fives that we're gonna talk about. So I might leave out some. So CalPERS, DMV, EDD, Department of Justice, CalHERS. We've done a lot of web app assessments for all of these clients, and what we wanted to share with you here today is some of the web application vulnerabilities that we just see over and over and over again. They keep coming up. Honestly, they've come up over the last 15 years. They're very common, they're very typical. They're in our top 10 list consistently, year over year. Make you aware of some of the sort of meticulous nature that's required to test for these vulnerabilities, and how to defend against them, of course, remediation. How do you prevent these vulnerabilities? And so to do that, we're going to talk about 5 very specific vulnerabilities and test cases. We might only have time for 4, but that's okay. The 5th one will be in the presentation. And you can ask questions throughout. You can raise your hand, save them to the end. I'm pretty flexible. Interruptions are no problem. These security presentations usually start out with some slides on vulnerabilities out in the news, Target and TJ Maxx and all that sort of thing. I'll spare you all of that. I think you've probably heard it countless times during the course of this symposium. But the point we want to make here is web application vulnerabilities are a very special case, because you've got IDS, you've got firewalls, you've got all of these other controls in place, but a web application vulnerability generally is going to tunnel right through all of these control devices. So you've got this pipeline all the way back to your soft inner core, all the way back to your data itself, and that's where these vulnerabilities come in. That's why they're very handy for your attackers. They know they're generally not detected by firewalls or IDS. They occur in the web browser at the app layer, and these network devices don't pick up on these vulnerabilities. In doing these types of security assessments over the past 15 years, I can think of maybe 3 or 4 cases where some sort of IDS type control picked up on a web layer type of attack. They're just not built for it. There are now web application firewalls. That's a totally different discussion for another time, but understand that you've got this pipe all the way back to your app, all the way back to your data that needs to be addressed. And so this is a very specific list of what we've seen here in the state of California in the last 12 months in doing security tests for various state agencies. These are the types of vulnerabilities that we see over and over again. And of those, we're going to talk about 5 in particular. Recognize some of those? And our list very closely matches the OWASP top 10. If you don't know OWASP, you definitely should go out and look at that, look at their top 10. They publish it every year, and it's pretty consistent year over year. The order changes a little bit. The order that we see, in Texas, California, Virginia, private sector clients, banks, is all very similar. And again, it's baffling to us that we've been doing this for 15 years and we still see SQL injection every time we go into a client for the first time. And I'll have to say that having been involved in over 200, maybe 250 web app security assessments in the last 15 years, only once in my entire career have I seen an app that's never been tested before not vulnerable to one of these top 10. Every single app we test, if it's never been tested before, it's vulnerable to 1 or more of these top 10. And we see apps that are vulnerable to all 10, half, just 1 or 2. It varies, of course. And that one client that I mentioned that was not vulnerable to any of these top 10, if we have time at the end, I'll tell you that story. I'll tell you why they weren't vulnerable. So these are our 5 case studies. We're going to start with user ID harvesting. Now, user ID harvesting in and of itself is not that critical. It may not seem like a big deal. But user ID harvesting is a precursor to an attack generally. And again, you've seen in the media, so-and-so criminal organization was able to harvest 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 email addresses from some brick and mortar, some retail, some organization. This is user ID harvesting. It could be an indication of a casual attack. It could be an indication of an advanced persistent threat. It's a precursor to everything that comes next. So again, in and of itself, it's not that critical, but it'll help you maybe detect something more sophisticated down the road if you're prepared to detect these, if you're defending against them. And also, when we talk about this in more detail, it'll kind of bring to light what I mentioned earlier, the meticulous nature of this testing. It'll make you think about some things that your developers generally don't think about, and you need to get them thinking about these things. They need to be putting on their hacker hat when they develop these applications. They need to be thinking of the what-ifs. And honestly, if there's one piece of advice, only one piece of advice I could ever give to people that are developing web apps, it's put on your what-if hat. Because the what-if I have a drop-down box, and I get an input that I'm not expecting, something that's not in my drop-down box. What if I get a number when I'm expecting a letter? If developers will put on the what-if hat, it's literally almost 8 out of 10 of the vulnerabilities associated with web apps if they would just do that. Ask themselves, what if I get something I'm not expecting? So user ID harvesting is a systematic collection of the valid IDs for your system. And it's half the puzzle, right? Once they have all the valid IDs, the next step is going to be to try and brute force passwords. So the key is going to be defending against those brute force attacks with Intruder Lockout and IDS and other features, SIM. And the easiest, the simplest example, most people aren't this bad, but just to illustrate how it works, the simplest example would be the ID you entered was not found, please try again. So you're giving the attacker too much information with that message. You've told them it's not a valid ID. You don't want to tell them that. When a user or an actor presents an ID and a password, you should give them a generic message. And we'll talk about why. And the last bullet there's many places you can give them this feedback. It's not necessarily just the message. It could be in the source, in the URI. We're going to talk about all these. Oops. Sorry about that. I hit the N key. So again, verbose error messages. You have to be very careful anytime you're using verbosity in an error message that you're giving to your actor, because your actor might be an attacker and you don't want to give them information that's useful to them. So this is an ID that's not valid for the system. This is an ID that's valid for the system. And just the fact that this text is a little different, it doesn't really matter what it says. The fact that it's different allows us to write an automated script that throws a million potential user IDs or email addresses at your site. And all the ones that are valid will come back with message A. All the invalid ones will come back with message B. And the script that we write, we have a tool that does this that I'll show you in a second. The tool that we use just builds a text file of all the valid IDs for your system. So useful information. Not necessarily a vulnerability in and of itself, but very useful information. And now here comes the meticulous nature of the verbosity in giving information to the actors, to the potential attackers. So this is an ID that we know doesn't exist on this system. This is an ID that we know does exist on this system. And if you look at the red text, it's identical. So verbosity not provided, yes? But did anybody pick up on the discrepancy? There's something different in the way this server is responding, this application is responding to a valid ID versus an invalid ID. Exactly. So the developer gave himself an error code on the URI so that he knows why that authentication failed. It's useful information to him, the developer, the people running the app, but it's useful information to me, the attacker, as well. So again, now I can farm valid IDs for this app. And it's going to get more complicated. So Intruder Lockout is one of the ways that you defend against brute force attacks. So now that I know 50,000 valid user IDs for your system, I'm going to take a password list of common passwords and throw it against those 50,000 IDs. The problem with that is most people have Intruder Lockout. They will lock out that account after whatever you set it to, 3, 4, 5 attempts, whatever your Intruder Lockout feature is. And you retain those for a certain period of time, too. So you might count 3 bad attempts or 5 bad attempts within a 15-minute period, or a 1-hour period, or a 24-hour period. We're going to figure this out. We're going to learn exactly what your period is. We're going to plug that into our tool. If your lockout retention period, or rather, if your lockout detection period is 15 minutes, and your intruder lockout is set to 5, well, I'm going to send 4 passwords every 15 minutes, and just wait an extra minute. So we just alter the timing of the tool that attacks the site. But uniquely, here in California and once in New York for a bank, I've only seen this twice in 15 years. And it's really peculiar. We were actually able, because of the way intruder lockout was implemented, we were able to farm passwords, not just user IDs. And the reason is, these are the messages that this application gave. Bad ID, good ID, good ID. So I'm just farming IDs, not a big deal. The problem was, once we deliberately locked out an account, and we continued to give it a bad password, so we threw 10,000 passwords against an account. The account's locked out. We then, just for the heck of it, we gave that locked out account the correct password. And lo and behold, the application developer, in his lines of code, he put in a different message for that logic flow if the correct password was given to a locked out account, for whatever reason. These are the actual screens. It's probably a little hard to see, but the red text down there, that is the text that we got when we put in a bad password for a locked out account. That is the message the app gave us when we gave the correct password for a locked out account. And this got a little worse because the policy of this particular client was when a user calls in with an intruder lockout account, they would clear the lockout flag, not change the password, and the user would just go ahead and log into the system. So this methodology could be used to farm thousands of valid passwords on this particular site. And of course, our advice to that client was, this message has got to be consistent, and when someone calls with a locked out account, you must force a password change. You can't just clear a lockout field. For this and many other reasons. Anybody recognize that site? Good. I hope it is adequately obfuscated, but that was a state of California app. I don't see any of them in the room at the moment, so that's good. If they saw it, they would recognize it. You know what? They probably wouldn't admit to it. This is the tool that we wrote. One of our testers put this tool together when he noticed that when he gave an application an invalid ID, just visually, he kind of observed, the application seemed to take longer to respond to post back the screen. And so he built a tool to actually measure the time. And this is a tool we use consistently now. So not only does your message have to be consistent and say something generic like, I'm sorry, we're unable to authenticate you at this time. Please try again later. And then maybe you refer them to the help desk if they continue to have a problem, right? I'm not telling them the ID's bad. I'm not telling them their account's locked out. I'm not giving them any useful information. So it's not just the consistency of the messaging in the URI, in the HTML source, in the hidden form elements, in the text itself. You actually have to be consistent across the board. So this is a timing measurement tool. And what we found was whenever you presented the app an invalid ID, it took almost 3 seconds to respond. It was looking it up, I guess. If you gave the app a valid ID, it responded right away, 250 milliseconds on average. And so Jim built this tool and was able to farm, I don't know, about 5,000 valid user IDs for the system, just based on timing. So what they ended up doing is they put in a false delay for valid logins. So they all were consistently taking almost 3,000 milliseconds. And now you're going to have a debate with, the people who are managing the app about performance. And you got to consider that trade-off. Security versus performance versus user friendliness versus user experience. Is this a risk I really care about, I want to mitigate? Maybe not. I'm not suggesting you do this, you don't do this. Be aware of it. Be aware of the risk. Make a decision. you may decide to accept this risk. Again, it's just information that's useful to an attacker. So we kind of touched on these points throughout. How do you mitigate against user ID harvesting, consistent messaging, consistent timing? Don't just clear a lockout field. Please don't use like generic passwords. Let your help desk do that. You know, whenever anyone calls to reset their password, they have some password that they use all day for every customer. We see that time and time again. Just give them a password generation tool. They're free. So that's mitigation. Any questions about user ID harvesting? All right, 15 minutes, one down. We'll probably get through 4. Insecure direct object reference. It also used to be called forceful browsing, but OWASP is calling it insecure direct object reference these days, so that's how we refer to it now. And I would have to say that in the state of California, other states, federal government, private sector, I'm going to have to say insecure direct object reference is #1 of the OWASP top 10, #1 of our top 10. And not necessarily because of prevalence or how often we see it, not just that, because we probably see cross-site scripting more often than this, but this is more severe. So I'm going to call it #1 because we see it more than anything else except maybe cross-site scripting and cross-site request forgery. But secondly, because it's much more devastating potentially than the ones that we see more often. So I would probably call this #1, particularly for the state of California. And it's very, very simple. And I'd have to say 8 out of 10 of the clients that we have here in California are vulnerable to this. We see it again and again. We've been seeing it. This is one of the ones that goes all the way back to 1998. It's an oldie but goodie. People haven't learned. They're still doing it. I don't know why. And it's so simple. It's so simple I can explain it in 10 seconds. And the issue is you're requesting a page. And we'll talk about online banking. It's your checking account. The post or the get statement that says, I want my balance, has your account number in it, the actual account number. So the developer, the application, has decided to entrust you with telling it which account you want the balance of. And all we have to do is change that number. It's so simple, and so many people let it happen. And this is just a simple example. It's in the HTML source. There was a client ID in this particular case. And all we do is start incrementing and decrementing the client ID number, and we ended up looking at data for other clients other than ourselves. So that's insecure direct object reference. And in the examples that we've seen here, it's been PII, social security number, name, address. I'm looking at my page, my account. There's a reference number either in the URI or in the post. And we just changed that reference number, and now I'm looking at another user of the system. I'm looking at their data, and it's so common. And how do you prevent against it? Well, very simple. You can do one of two things. Either A, you look up that ID when it's presented to you. You don't trust it. You look it up in a table versus who you're currently authenticated as. Or B, you just use a reference number, which also requires a lookup. So if we go back to our example of online banking, instead of, I want the balance of checking account number 1234567, you would say, give me the balance of checking, which is equal to 1. So maybe my checking is a 1. It's an index number. My savings is a 2. My car loan is a 3. So the only thing that would be in the URI or the post would be a 1, 2, or 3, and the server has to look it up versus who you're logged in as, versus you just flat out saying, I want this account number. It's very, very simple. We've seen developers kind of think about this and decide, yeah, that's probably not a good idea to put the actual account number in there. Let me put something else there, like a reference number. And the most common reference number we see is a GUID, because they're easy to generate, they're very unique. And they are, if used properly, they're secure. A salted MD5 hash, a SHA-2 hash, a GUID. These are all good reference values that we can't brute force or attack practically. So the value itself is good. However, the mistake that they often make is they put this reference number. So instead of saying, I want the balance for account 123456, it's this reference number that gets looked up, and I get the balance for whatever this corresponds to. And you can't guess the next one of these. It's mathematically not practical. No hacker is going to bother trying if he sees a good, because you really can't do it. Maybe the NSA can do it. Debatable. But these are good. It's like a salted MD5 hash. No one's going to guess the next one. No one's going to guess a valid account number. The problem with this is when you put it in the URI like this, and again, we see it time and time again, this third bullet here, all of those, is anybody that can't read that? Is that legible? Great. So all of those places is where this value gets recorded. So if someone else becomes privy to this value, they can look at your account data. They're just going to log in as them or some account that they registered, some phony account, whatever. If they become privy to that value, they're going to give it to the app. They're going to get your data. It's going to be in the history file of that local machine. Any proxy that sits between the actor and your server, everybody has an outbound proxy, right? Everybody has the inbound proxy. Who knows how many proxies are between you and the web application you're connecting to? The refer field, that's on your local hard drive, load balancers, firewalls, IDS. If you have nifty little toolbars installed, like the Google toolbar, and this one's actually very interesting, the Ask toolbar, the Google toolbar, Alta Vista, all of that stuff. Those toolbars, particularly the Google toolbar, they take things that they see in your URI, they put it in their search database, and they index it. So what we saw here for a state of California client was literally, they were using this type of safe value. There were literally thousands of these in the Google database, and all we have to do is search Google for this site, this server-side executable, and we got thousands of these. Now, their session timeout was 1 hour, so they're not good forever. And actually, no, I'm sorry. This client I'm thinking of that was here in California, their timeout was 24 hours. So when we get those thousands of values, we just start trying them, and anyone that's less than 24 hours old, it works, we got their data. Took screenshots, reported it to the client. So please don't do that. Just use an index, look it up. Let the server do the work. Never trust the actor to provide you the information of what he wants. Always look it up for him or her. And again, we touched on the remediations throughout. Check them on the server. Bullet number 2 is very important. It's, again, something we see 8 times out of 10. And actually, we'll cover it better in SQL injection. But the developer has a drop-down box. He's expecting one of 4 particular options. Understand that hackers can easily manipulate those drop-down boxes. And put on your what-if hat. Tell your developers to put on their what-if hat. Any questions about IDOR? So cross-site scripting. As far as frequency goes, definitely the number 1. We see cross-site scripting. I'd be hard-pressed to think of a web application that's never been tested before in the past 10 years that was not vulnerable to cross-site scripting. Almost always see it. Now, the severity of that particular instance of cross-site scripting is debatable because they vary from whatever to something very severe that allows you to look at other customers' data. So cross-site scripting runs the gamut of risk levels. And how many people are not intimately familiar with cross-site scripting? All right, so you guys, most people have heard of it by now, so I won't get into too many details. But essentially, it's the ability to take some script, give it to the site, and then have it replayed at some later time for another actor. Plain and simple. The most common attack vector for cross-site scripting, and there are many, there are hundreds, but the one we usually use as a test case, the one that's kind of most interesting, most useful, is to steal the session credential, steal your cookie. Because if I have your cookie, I can become you on that website. So it's the most fun with cross-site scripting is steal cookies. The other thing you could do with cross-site scripting is you could throw up a dialog box. You could tell the user that their password has expired and they should re-authenticate and re-enter their password. And all this pop-up box is going to do is send the password to my web server and then take you to the next screen and you'll never know what happened. And the way that we do this, the way you execute a cross-site scripting attack, and by the way, there's 3 types, stored, reflected, DOM-based. This presentation, I probably should have mentioned at the beginning, is a compacted version of a 4-hour presentation that we have. We covered the other 2 methods in the other one. We're just going to cover stored today because it's the most severe. And the way you execute this is you look for an opportunity, some sort of form field where you're expecting user input, and instead of whatever's supposed to be there, a name, an address, a phone number, you're filling out some form, whatever. Instead of putting in the actual data you're supposed to put in, I put in script, and that script gets stored by the application and then replayed later for somebody else. Or it gets executed and does something that's useful to me, like take your cookie and give it to my web server. This site, the reason it's up here as an example is this was, what am I going to say? This was a loan application for a private sector client. Each one of these is a screen that's, you know, like 2 pages long that probably has 20 form field inputs. So this site had literally like 120 form field inputs because they're applying for a home loan. And we went through it with an automated tool. They had a code scanner. And understand that code scanners, automated tools, Nessus, you know, whatever you want to buy, app layer vulnerabilities, they'll get maybe 20%. They're good at the network level vulnerabilities. They don't catch logic problems. You know, user ID harvesting, they're never going to catch something like that. That's purely a logic problem. You can't get that with a scanner. You have to do it with manual testing. So this had been through a code scanner and a Nessus scan and an app scanner and got a clean bill of health. And we tested it manually, and I don't know why the tester did this, and maybe he's just a masochist, but he manually went through every form field and attempted script. And you know, I think it took him like 4 or 5 hours. So all of these pages, at this point he's on like 100 form fields that he's tried to input script, and he found one. So as soon as you see the script echoed back to you, rendered in the page, you know, it didn't execute because the syntax was wrong, because you have to play with syntax on cross-site scripting. But he got partial interpretation because it got rendered on the page. If it gets rendered on the page, we know you're interpreting the script. There was a syntax error. It didn't quite work, but now I know you're vulnerable. And we went back and we talked to this client and we said, what? And the client was, they were hip to cross-site scripting. They knew about it. They knew how to defend against it, but the developer just forgot to call the canonicalization for that one form field input, thoroughness. And luckily, the tester found it. And remediating cross-site scripting is actually very easy. There's a cheat sheet on OWASP. Actually, OWASP has a cheat sheet on how to remediate for every single one of these vulnerabilities, everything on their top 10, and more. Escaping the input, canonicalization, you know, not taking the semicolon, not taking the colons, not taking the single quote. Don't accept these as input, right? You must filter anything you get from an end user, anything you get from the actor, assume it's potentially malicious, filter it, normalize it, make sure it's what you expected. Oh, HTTP only. So it's an interesting setting. When you render a page that's going to provide input, if you set this flag in the HTML source, HTTP only, even if we execute cross-site scripting, we can't steal the session cookie. It's a nice little security feature built into HTML. Highly recommended. It's in the OWASP cheat sheet also. Every recommendation that I'm giving you today is in the OWASP cheat sheet. So if you didn't get it in your notes or missed something, it's all on the OWASP cheat sheets. Any questions about, yes, sir?
Would that prevent your own scripts that you intentionally have on that page from running?
The HTTP only flag? It does not. So what HTTP only does is it says script cannot lift the cookie in this browser session. Script cannot read the cookie. If you had script that had to read the cookie, that would be strange because you would just rely on the post to give it to you, right? Get it that way. You don't have to get it through script. I can't think of a use case why a developer would have to get a cookie through script. He would just get it from the post or the get. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Static code analysis tools, have we found them to be effective and effectively used on development lifecycles so that they can catch a lot of stuff?
Yes, so you know, we've looked at many of them. Veracode, so we've looked at a dozen, and we've helped deploy them here in the state of California agencies and other clients as well. I'm going to have to say I'm most impressed with Veracode, but with these caveats. It tends to identify more code quality issues than security issues. And again, when you're talking about a dynamic vulnerability, the success rate is maybe 20% false positive, 20% false negative. If you're talking about static vulnerabilities, like with cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, SQL injection, these more static type things that are pretty succinct, their success rate's more closer to 80, 90%. Well, false positive, so false positives, I mean, literally there are thousands. But you can go through and vet those, right? What you have to worry about are the false negatives, vulnerability that the code scanner didn't detect. That's where you run into problems. And they're pretty good with the static vulns, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, et cetera. They don't catch the logic flow problems. And I would say you have to do both. You have to do everything. You have to train your developers, run the code scanner, do a pen test, use a secure coding standard and give it to your developers, the OWASP standard, make sure they're aware of it, they use it, they put on their what-if hat, all of these things. It's layered security, right? I would definitely not rely on just a code scanner. There is a client here that maybe 2-3 years ago, I can't remember, we went in, wanted to sell them a manual pen test. They said, no, it's okay, we got 2-3 scanners, all our apps go through these scanners. 2-3 months later, they were on the 6 o'clock news, insecure direct object reference, scanners don't detect that. And they were calling us the next day. So do both, pen test and the scanner. Any other cross-site scripting questions? SQL injection. Anybody not intimately familiar with SQL injection? Yeah, it's pretty prevalent these days, but I'll put a slightly new twist on it for you, so I won't bore you with that. You guys know SQL injection and how it works. And this is a SQL injection attack on an authentication. You know, there's many places you can do it, right? You can do it on a search function. You can do it, let's talk online banking. When you're asking for your account balance, maybe you can inject there. Maybe you can inject on a login page. We'll talk about a login page. This was not California, this was another state. And we attempted to inject the username and the password fields, no problem. They were filtering. We didn't get any kind of verbose error message, no indications that they were vulnerable. However, the site had this drop-down box. You give it the username, you give it the password, and you tell it where you want to go post-authentication. And again, the developers were hip to SQL injection. They understood it. They knew how to escape characters. They knew how to canonicalize. They were doing all the right things for those two fields. This is what the post looked like. Username, password, and then there was a 2-digit agency ID that was the result of that drop-down box. Unfortunately, they did not perform their SQL injection sanitization on the drop-down box because it's a drop-down box. That's all I'll ever get, right? No. So we took our SQL injection and we put it in the field for the agency ID. We just made a true statement. As you know, that's how SQL injection works for an authentication function. And it's interesting to note, if you're doing SQL injection on a login page, if the user database is SQL, and you succeed in injecting the login page, 99 times out of 100, I mean, you might ask, well, who am I going to be logged in as? Because essentially that statement at the end of the day is just going to be equals true. So what does that do for me? It actually drops you into the user table as the very first person that's in that table. And the very first person in any SQL database that's storing user IDs and passwords is 99.9% chance it's going to be the SA. So we were SA. And remediation is very similar to everything we've talked about before, and it goes back to what I said at the beginning. If there's one thing I could tell all developers to do, it would be put on your what-if hat and do something about it. What if I get input I'm not expecting? The biggest problem with apps today. So if you're expecting an email address, this is a regular expression that filters out everything that's not an email address, as an example. Any questions about SQL injection? I think so. Any questions about SQL injection? Very good. We're going to get all 5. Cross-site request forgery. It's like cross-site scripting. Almost every site's vulnerable that's never been tested before. If they don't know about it and they don't know to look for it. Anybody who's not intimately familiar with cross-site request forgery? All right, so this one's a little more obscure, interesting. And it's very similar to cross-site scripting. And essentially, in a nutshell, cross-site request forgery is the ability to lure you to a link. I'm going to send you an email, an instant message, a virus on your computer, or my evil website. I just have to have you come to my evil website. If I can get you to my evil link, and you're currently authenticated to the target app, the app I'm interested in, I can perform a function. That's cross-site request forgery. So here's a simple example. You run a retirement site, and I put up an evil website about retirement planning. I get you to come to my website. We're going to talk about retirement planning, some tips, free info, whatever. And I'm going to take you through multiple pages. And one of those pages, I'm going to ask you a specific question. What is the current balance of your pension fund in dollars? Oh, I don't know. You're either A, going to pull the statement out of your drawer, or you're going to go log in to your pension fund and figure out your balance. If you do that, and that's what I want you to do, you do it in another tab or another browser window, and then you come back to my evil website. Yeah, my current balance is $40,000. As soon as you hit the next button, because the target site is open in another tab or another browser window, the link that I'm going to give you for the next button isn't just the next page. It's actually going to have embedded in it a URI that goes to that retirement fund and performs a function. Maybe I could change your password. Maybe I could transfer some money. I can do whatever I want. I can do anything that you can do on that app. That's cross-site request forgery. So it has the potential to be very dangerous. However, I do have to lure you somehow. You've got to click on my email or come to my evil website. And the attack that we do most frequently is we reset a password. That one's really easy to defend with. Your password reset function should always include a prompt for the current password. Then my attack's not going to work. But I'd say 40–50% of the sites we look at don't require current password for password resets. Question?
Certain browsers are a lot more resistant to that attack, though, aren't they?
Yeah, Firefox and Chrome are becoming very good at detecting it and throwing up a dialog box. Now it's up to the user to say yes or no. So it's up to the user to comprehend the dialog box and to make the right choice. So how do you remediate against cross-site request forgery? I don't know about that first one. I'm having second thoughts on that. I mean, maybe, maybe not. But if you do them via get, and you know what, get's not even required for this attack. You can do this attack in a post, but here's the deal. It's significantly more complicated, and we haven't really touched on this. We do in the 4-hour presentation. But you know, when we look at risk and we try and give it a score of how severe a certain risk is, you have to look at the threat landscape and the sophistication of the attack, right? If you go to NIST, CVSS, one of their metrics is difficulty of attack. The attack's real easy. Any script kiddie in the world can do it. That's going to drive up the risk, drive up the score. If the attack is more complicated, it drives down the score, it drives down the risk. Doing it via get is very, very simple and very, very easy, and this many attackers know how to do that. Doing it via post, not a lot of people know how to do that one. They're going to have to write their own custom tools. It's a little more complicated. So first bullet's debatable. We already touched on the second bullet. And the best way to defend against it is to include some kind of little token that's presented to passback. So when the sensitive function is performed on your site, the legitimate site, there's a token that gets passed. On my evil site, I have no way of being privy to that token. So when I send my post that does an evil thing, the token will be absent and the request will fail. That's the easiest prevention. And if you want more details on that, it's in the cheat sheet. Any questions on CSRF? Alrighty. All right, so I will tell you about my anecdotal story. 15 years of doing these tests. Over 200 web apps, transactional web apps with sensitive data, the one client that I've ever seen that was not vulnerable to something in the OWASP top 10. And it wasn't because they thought about security, interestingly enough. It wasn't because their site was so simple, it wasn't a big deal. It was a large, extremely complex online banking site for a Japanese bank. The reason they were not vulnerable to cross-site scripting and SQL injection and insecure direct object reference was because their developers wrote tight code. I don't know how else to put it. They were secure as a byproduct of extremely intelligent, efficient, tight code. They wouldn't allow any input they didn't expect because they didn't see why you would do that. They weren't thinking about security. They didn't, when I sat down with them, I mean, we literally beat our head against the walls. We went over there originally with 3 people. I brought 2 more people for the second week, and we could not get these people. It was the first time we'd ever not owned somebody. And we were very frustrated. So we sat down with them afterwards, and we're like, well, tell us about your SQL injection. And they just looked at me across the table and said, what's SQL injection? So there you go. Efficient code produces security. Any other questions? 2 minutes. Cool. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.